So, dealing with the aspect of the revolution that took place in America, we see that prior to industrial revolution, there were no well-established markets during earlier days. So, the needs of human beings were very few, and these were met through barter system, which means the persons dealing with the goods were not completely done by one single person. So the resources were limited and they have cultivating activities and small scale industries in the sense that the manufactured goods that were usually made not by machines but by hands. They would produce one thing and go to the marketplace and they will exchange with others. So this is usually known as barter system. Exchange of possession of one goods with other, catering to their mutual requirements. So there was no competition at all in the market. It was based on mutual wants and requirements. So the wants of the people were not many since the availability of goods were very few. The Industrial Revolution has brought in radical changes in the lives of human beings as regards the goods and articles consumed by them in their day to day life. So, the consumer goods floated the markets and the trade started adopting various devices to sell their goods manufactured by them. Since the innovations of electric power and use of the mechanical devices had made these manufacturers to undertake manufacturing activities in large scale. And they were in search of new markets. They wanted to sell all the manufactured goods. So, as more and more inventions took place, more and more goods and articles were manufactured, and the human beings started relying upon them more often. Since there was hesitation in making use of the goods, but due to the reason that the manufacturers have created uh, the means to convince the consumers as to its advantage of making use of the goods and the drastic change that would take place in their lifestyle. This persuaded the consumers to make use of these manufactured products. So the encounters between the buyers and the seller increased, and the law of demand and supply came into operation. This clearly indicates that the markets were well established during those days. So, as the society was considered as laissez-faire, which means that the intervention of the state was very much meager. The state used to intervene in the lives of the citizens very rarely. Since they did not have an intention to regulate the markets, there were no appropriate laws being legislated at that time. There was no effective laws to regulate the relationship between the buyer and the seller. So, this emboldened the traders to monopolize the market, and the trader became the king. Since alternative products were not available and very few manufacturers were there, and only the large scale manufacturer with high quality products had created market for himself, amounting to monopoly, which is nothing but a sale of the product by a single person. The reason why we say that he is a king is he determined his own terms against the consumers. He fixed his own price, having least botheration with regard to demand and supply. So there were no measures to check the deviations that the manufacturers have adopted in exploitation of the consumers are concerned. So the principles of Cave Tempter came into existence, which shows that The situation that was present during those days was one sided. Whatever the terms the manufacturer determine would have to be accepted by the buyer. If at all the buyer wants to purchase the goods, they were at his own risk. If he suffers any loss in future with regard to use of the goods or for any reason, or if the sold good is not appropriately working, if there is any breakdown, then it is up to the manufacturer to see that the product is repaired. But instead, if he minds that he is not going to undertake the repair, then it was considered to be ultimate loss to the consumer. So this so the gave tempter signifies let the buyer beware, and that was the rule that existed. So the conditions and warranties fixed by the manufacturer and trader were binding on the consumers. The consumer came to be abused, exploited by unscrupulous traders whose only object was to make profit. By adoption of various means, they never bothered about the ethics, they never bothered that they would uh, make their own rules and regulation. Since there was no rule and law, whatever they had made was the rule of the day. So, doctrine of freedom of contract, where only a kind of a situation that helped the consumers, and that too in a limited sense. So, the doctrine of freedom of contract made the traders even more bolder in their pursuit of making more profit. All these factors culminated in a new phenomenon resulting in the abuse of and exploitation of the consumers. So, this led to the consumer movement throughout the world. The developed countries like United States of America, United Kingdom, and other European countries were the first to realize that there was a need to have a regulation being made by the governments in their own countries to ensure that the exploitative practices of the manufacturers and sellers will be totally eliminated. So, various legislations were passed to achieve this objective. The concept of consumer came into existence, and consumer protection was felt to be an essentiality with the utmost importance, because many of the citizens during those days were in one or the other form considered as consumers. So, the primary duties of the state was to bring in appropriate law. So, subject of consumer protection has received and increased that attention in India as well as other developing countries. Since India had also started the manufacturing activities, since the developed countries were in search of huge markets, and India being a consumer country, they wanted to bring in the products being launched in India, and that is how India was also bothered as to regulate these issues of consumers, and hence India also felt that there was a requirement to have regulation of the consumer interest, especially to be implemented on manufacturers, and creating awareness with regard to the rights of the consumers were concerned. So, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution in the year 1985 giving importance to the need for consumer education. So, it has laid down certain guidelines urging the government to develop and encourage the development of general consumer education and information programs, bearing in mind the cultural tradition of the people concerned. So, according to these guidelines, the government were called upon to take care of the interest of the consumers of all kinds and class. Since we find consumers belonging to different class based upon their criteria to select the products, and uh, the needs of the consumers were different for different classes, and based upon that the classification of consumers are done. So these guidelines which were unanimously adopted by the General Assembly on 9th April 1985, are also described as chapter of human rights. You can imagine to what extent the importance of consumer rights were considered during those days. They represent an internationally recognized act of minimum objective potentiality being of particular assistance to the developing countries. So the recognition of these rights equivalent to that of human rights were made because of the reason that many of them wanted to regulate the issues of consumers and manufacturers. Ultimately, there should be a harmonious relationship that exists between sellers and the consumers. That is what is expected from creation of this right as a human right chapter. So they represent an internationally recognized set of minimum objectives, potentially being of particular assistance to the developing countries. And these guidelines represent an initial step or attempt to create a global framework for consumer protection policy and measures. So they acted as impetus for many countries and for many people in their own countries, and as such, every country had legislated a law in recognition of the consumer rights, curtailing the exploitative practices of the manufacturers. So every year on 15th of March, it is observed as World Consumer Rights Day. So the significance of this day is that on this day in 1962, John F. Kennedy, the then President of the United States of America, declared four rights pertaining to consumers. Later, the International Organization of Consumer Union added three more rights to the list, and all these rights have been included in the United Nations Charter on Human Rights and also in the 20-point program of the Government of India. So, even though India had fallen in the category of the developing nation, it could not remain aloof, sacrificing the rights of the consumers. So, to that extent, even India and other underdeveloped nations also, in tune with the practices of developed nations, had made their mind to legislate a consumer law. So, the Consumer Protection Act 1986 was legislated for the first time in India to rescue the consumers, to create awareness, and also implement policies wherever necessary to educate the consumers with regard to their rights are concerned. So it is not only the law that deals with the consumer protection, it also is a first kind of a law which clearly indicated as to in what manner there should be the formation of councils, what would be the agenda in the government's policy to create the awareness among the consumers so that their rights can be protected, and the manner in which the redressal mechanism should work. All these were included in that particular law adopted by India, and there were also number of laws that existed pre-constitutional and post-constitutional laws. Some of these enactments that dealt with taking care of consumer right in an indirect manner were Sale of Goods Act 1930, the Indian Contract Act, the Indian Penal Code, the Drugs and Cosmetic Act 1940, the Agricultural Produce Grading and Marking Act 1937, the Drugs and Magic Remedies Objectionable Advertisements Act 1954, the Prevention of Food Adulteration 1969, the Standard of Weights and Measures Act 1976, and Bureau of Indian Standards Act 1986 were some of the legislations which took care of protecting consumers not in direct way but in an indirect manner. So this list is illustrative in nature, which means that there were in existence other laws in addition to these laws. So the Constitution of India has many number of provisions, especially the Article 21, which deals with right of consumers. Since interpretations have taken place as to what exactly is the right to life, many of them have interpreted it as in a wider sense. When we make a reference to the judgments given by Supreme Court and the High Court, that it is very wide. It includes almost everything pertaining to an individual as a human being, which deals with the right to life and personal liberty, subject to the condition that the right has to be exercised in such a way that you should not be on a wrongful path. That means the law has to take its own course while dealing with these kinds of aspects. Say, for example, if a person is to be tried for murder and he is convicted for capital punishment, we cannot say that it is violation of Article 21, since there is an exception for that, wherein the law will take its course for trying that trial for murder, having given all the opportunities to defend the case against the person who has been alleged with the commitment of murder. He has to prove that he is innocent, and the state will take its own course to prove that he is guilty. To that extent, Article 21 is clear that it is widely interpreted. So, Article 47, which guarantees the right to health, and Article 48, which aims at the pollution free environment for all citizens, have also been covered under this Protection Act of the Consumer Protection Law. So, the only difference between these laws and the Consumer Protection Act of 1986, when compared as to what makes the consumer law unique when compared to these laws, is that the consumer law is exclusive right having many provisions, also referring the setting up of the mechanism for redressal of consumer redressal, and also giving the judgments for the complaints made by the consumer at the earliest possible time with less tensions, and also easy procedures that have been made available under this particular law, having its own rules and regulation, and this make this law unique, having established the district forum and state commission at the state level, and central commission or national commission at the center, which is established by the central government. So these are some of the advantages that we can have with the legislation of consumer law when compared to other laws. Since for other laws you are required to make complaint in a civil court or a criminal court depending upon the nature of the offense. So with this we'll conclude today's discussion with regard to the history of consumer law. Thank you one and all.